All right, live from CCI Toronto, it's 4:20 and this is Condos Up in Smoke. Welcome to all of you joining our session today. I'd like to first start out by thanking CCI Toronto for having us, as well as TSCC 2556 for letting us host our discussion here today. My name is Megan Malloy, I'm a condo lawyer at Elliott Associates, and I'll be facilitating our discussion on Condos Up in Smoke. We've also got a great panel here for you today. I'm going to have them introduce themselves.
My name is Tanya Halleck. I'm the Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness at First Service Residential.
And I'm Luis Hernandez. I'm a condominium lawyer.
And my name is Warren Kleiner. I'm a condominium lawyer and a partner at Shipley Wright. And for anybody who sees me at any other point in time, I dress for the occasion.
Likewise.
Right, so as many of you watching today will know, it's 10/17, aka cannabis is officially legal in Canada today. The focus of our discussion today will be the impact of legalization in a condo setting. There's been a lot of mixed reaction leading up to today, some excitement, some concerns, some fear, and most of all, many, many questions. So we're here today to hopefully answer some of the questions that you may have, and the hope is that you'll be able to take some of our discussion here today and apply it back to your own condo corporations. So let's get right into it. Let's start by discussing how we got here. Warren, can you give us some background on how legalization came to be?
Sure. So, I think what happened was attitudes have changed in Canada. Canadians were already smoking pot in large numbers. It's been easily accessible to anyone who wants to get it. In fact, some police forces stopped years ago laying charges for minor possession. Everything also became muddy when Canada legalized medicinal cannabis, and we started seeing dispensaries popping up around the place. So what ended up happening was Trudeau promised it as part of his platform. I think it was part of his sort of a younger persona. And what he really did was he tapped into the fact that Canadians generally have accepted that cannabis is not nearly as bad as many other things that in fact are legal, whether it's cigarettes, alcohol, and things like that. Trudeau went through with his promise. And here we are today with legalized marijuana.
All right, so we know that the provinces have all gone about creating their own individual rules for what this is going to look like. So can you tell us a little bit about what Ontario has done with legalization?
Sure. So in Ontario, you're allowed to possess up to 30 grams, and you're allowed to also cultivate up to 4 plants per household. Very important, not per person, but per household. At the moment, no stores are open in Ontario. They're not going to be open until April of 2019. But of course, you are able to get legal cannabis through the Ontario Cannabis Store, which is online, and it's delivered via Canada Post. So originally, the Wynne government said that you're only going to be able to smoke cannabis in your private residence. However, the Ford government changed that, and they're aligning your ability to smoke with the Smoke Free Ontario Act. So essentially, you're going to be able to smoke cannabis anywhere that you're allowed to smoke tobacco in Ontario.
Okay. So since our focus is on condos today, what about the impact of legalization in condominiums?
So as Warren mentioned there, we've had a lot of feedback. There's been a lot of excitement and buzz, so to speak, of what's going on. We've been talking about this for years, though. Same as we've been talking about tobacco, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but a lot of it is fear, because people don't understand and don't know enough about cannabis to understand what the implications are in condos and anywhere in Ontario, but condos specifically, since we're speaking to our condo audience. As Warren mentioned, the police, I know a few years ago in a condo that we managed, a unit owner had reported she saw pot plants on someone else's balcony, and when the police came, they went, it's 2 plants, and left. So the enforcement, you're right, there's sort of been an acceptance in Canada that even though it's not been legal, it's been generally accepted that this is what's happening here.
Yeah, and to that point, a lot of people have been afraid that it's going to be Woodstock all of a sudden. You're going to get off your elevator and your hallway's going to be filled with smoke, and that's just not the reality. Canada has been very much okay with smoking for a long time. This is more of a formality. The government's real intentions was to get cannabis out of the youth, to deal with the criminal ramifications. Their main priority was not how multi-unit dwellings are going to be affected, but at the end of the day, people who were smoking before are going to keep smoking now, and people who weren't smoking before, it's very unlikely that there's going to be an uptick that's enough to be scary.
Okay. So will condo owners be allowed to smoke in their condo buildings, and if so, where?
Okay, so that's going to be something that will be entirely dependent on the condominium. So as Warren stated, the Ford government said that it's going to be the same as the Smoke-Free Ontario Act. If you could smoke tobacco in this place in your condominium, you'll probably be able to smoke cannabis, but it'll be primarily resident-based. It'll be what each building wants to do and how they want to manage it, whether they want to regulate it, whether they want to outright ban smoking, and there's a lot of questions that are being asked right now.
Okay. And do condo corporations have tools to address the restriction of cannabis within their communities?
Absolutely. So first you can deal with what's already in place, which is existing nuisance rules. So nuisance rules dealt with substantial interference of the quiet use and enjoyment of people's units. So that already exists with respect to noise, with respect to odors. It applies to smoke as well, and pretty much every condo has provisions that will help it fall back on those provisions to make sure that there's no disruption to other people. The condos have also been putting into place new rules that will help them sort of regulate smoking in general and cannabis smoking now that it's legalized. And it can also be addressed with respect to the declaration, but the declaration is quite a high threshold. It would require 80% of unit owners to provide written consent to change the declaration, but it's something that we're seeing with more frequency and something that's happening quite a bit in Ottawa. You know, there's a lot more smoke-free buildings now in Ottawa and in Ontario as well.
Yeah, and we certainly have helped some condominiums amend their declaration to prohibit smoking. In fact, some corporations that implemented rules and then wanted to make sure that it was more difficult to change. And yeah, a lot of corporations are doing that.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about how to pass a rule if a condo corporation was interested in going the extra step to
Sure.
solidify this?
So passing a rule is actually, it's a lot easier than passing a bylaw or amending the declaration with the written consent of owners. Essentially what the board has to do is they propose the rule, they send notice of that rule to the unit owners, and in the notice, owners are advised that they're going to have 30 days to requisition a meeting of owners. And essentially, one of two things will happen. No requisition, in which case that rule will be enforced as of the date that was stated in the notice, which should be 31 days after they actually sent the notice, or there will be a requisition. And in which case the corporation's going to have to call and hold a meeting of owners to vote on that rule, and as long as that rule is not voted down at that meeting, the rule is valid. And we've seen a couple of requisitions. First of all, a lot of our corporations have passed rules without problem. But we have seen some requisitions, and in fact, the vast majority of those votes were in favor of the no smoking rule. So there are only a few corporations that we're aware of where that rule was actually defeated on a requisition.
Okay. So as of today, obviously cannabis is legal. So if I'm a tobacco smoker in a condo corporation, or I guess if I'm a cannabis smoker, what's my opinion that people are still being allowed to smoke tobacco but not cannabis? How are we dealing with that issue?
So this runs into the issue, I think, about tobacco versus cannabis, and the fact that some corporations want to try to prohibit cannabis but allow people to continue to smoke tobacco. And that's something that we find problematic. Rules need to be reasonable. And we have a problem with a corporation that tries to ban cannabis without banning tobacco smoke at the same time, because we find it hard to see how cannabis smoke getting into your unit or the common elements from another unit is more of a problem than tobacco smoke. So really, if you're going to ban one, you have to ban the other. But if you don't have any rules right now that deal with that, then notionally you can smoke in your unit, whether it's cannabis or tobacco, but you have to keep in mind, as Luis was saying before, that corporations, almost every one, will already have rules in place that prevent disturbance of other units, whether it's through noise, odor, smoke, and those types of things.
Okay.
Just to add one final comment to that, the Condo Act has actually changed, and there's new provisions that will deal with the unreasonable disturbance of units as well. So not only would you have those protections in your deck, or if you're passing new rules, but the Condo Act, it's coming to force, it's not in force yet, but it deals with that as well under its dangerous activities provision under 117. So there's a lot of tools that the corporation has at its disposal to mitigate these issues.
Yeah. And I want to be clear, we have in fact, for condominium corporations that do not have specific rules that ban any form of smoking, We have taken steps to prevent people from smoking tobacco in their units when it was disturbing other people, as well as from smoking cannabis in their units when it was disturbing other people. So we've been successful without these no smoking rules.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you already have provisions to help you address these issues, then what's the point really of going the extra step to passing a rule or amending your declaration?
Right, so one of the main benefits that I see with implementing a no smoking rule is that it puts your building on a path towards becoming smoke free. So what these rules do is they ban smoking in the units, but we always grandfather, for various reasons, we grandfather all of the existing smokers in the building. So those people can continue to smoke. But we have a proviso that if they are actually disturbing other people because smoke leaves their unit and gets into the common elements or other units, the unit owner is responsible to take all necessary steps to stop that smoke migration, or we can put a stop to it. So just because we grandfather doesn't mean you can smoke to your heart's content and bother everybody. But what ends up happening is people who buy in and new residents are bound by that no smoking rule. So that seems to be the benefit that a lot of corporations see, is that it puts them on that path to becoming smoke free.
And from what we've seen, it's much easier to pass rules too, and then therefore be able to enforce and get compliance, as opposed to a declaration where you need more owners to actively vote for something as opposed to passively not defeat something.
Okay, and we're just talking about smoking. So how does this apply to people who want to grow cannabis within their units?
Again, it goes back to some of the fear. We understand there are some odors that come with the cannabis plants, but there's all kinds of other odor things that we're not going to get into today. But it's the quantity has been restricted, because we know there was a height restriction before, and that's been just to the quantity of the number of plants. But again, we also suffer from humidity issues from people that have a veritable greenhouse in their units as well, that causes different issues. So from earlier discussions, we talked about it's not just the cultivation, it's then what do you do with that afterwards. And it's that production and consumption after that that causes more of the nuisance and interference with the other owners that we need to be mindful of. An important point before is distinguishing. It's just as legal to ingest tobacco as it is cannabis, so we need to, that's one of the reasons you can't differentiate with respect to being reasonable.
What about a condo's duty to accommodate? So you have a resident that has a disability, they want to smoke cannabis to help treat their disability, and they approach you. What happens in that situation? Are they going to be allowed to smoke in their units?
So with respect to accommodation, the legalization today doesn't really affect that regime. The medical marijuana regime is still under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So the duty to accommodate hasn't really changed. At the end of the day, the duty to accommodate really deals with a back and forth process whereby the condominium, the board, property management are really working with the owner or resident to make sure that their needs are being met. Now I believe, and I have to agree, Warren had mentioned earlier, before we started, how he had experience in his practice. He's never seen a medical professional dictate that you need to smoke to be able to receive the benefits of cannabis. Now, I don't know if anyone else has seen that, but I haven't seen it.
I certainly have not, and I would think in many cases if the individual needs to smoke it, there's a very good chance that they'll be able to use a vaporizer, which is a lot less, there's no combustion, there's much less odor, and it's less likely to disturb other people. But listen, if it happens in the right set of circumstances, the Ontario Human Rights Code trumps everything. So it trumps our declaration, bylaws, rules, and we will have to find a way to accommodate somebody if and when we actually get that the proper medical documentation to show that somebody, for whatever reason, must in fact smoke it.
You must have dealt with that before in your buildings.
Well, it'll be interesting to see who would win in an allergic to smoke versus I must smoke scenario. So we haven't seen that yet, but there are a lot of complaints that happened before today in the legalization with respect to odor penetration, whether it was tobacco or cannabis. So that's why, again, to the fear-mongering part, we're not that worried that there's going to be a huge spike in consumption despite the online orders today.
The spike is really going to be, I expect that you might see a couple more complaints in the short term just because people are excited and celebrating and making use of their new freedom, but we don't expect that to be a major problem. If you smoke, you already smoke.
That's right.
And this is where education comes in, right? It's important.
So I guess if there is a big influx seen, and it's legal today, people are celebrating. Tanya, can you take us through some of the steps that a condo can take to monitor the possible influx of cannabis smoke and how to enforce the rules in that situation?
The difficulty is determining where the nuisance is occurring, right? Normally someone would come to the management office and say, I'm smelling cannabis, tobacco, whatever it is. You need to help me because I'm entitled to remove this nuisance from my home. Same with some noise complaints. Often it's hard to find the source, but once that is found, there's the regular process of any kind of enforcement with respect to sending letters, asking for compliance, escalating to legal services if we need to enforce that. Generally when people get a letter from a lawyer's office, they tend to comply a little more than they do when they get it from the properties management office. The difference is, yesterday, if we got a cannabis odor complaint, it wasn't legal. Today it is, so it's sort of some gray area that we'll have to work our way through with respect to compliance, but a rule is a rule, and the board and the property management is bound to enforce that. And the good thing is, the burden to stop the nuisance lies with the owner, not with the victim of the odor who wants it to stop.
And there's one thing that I find that a lot of owners, a typical response is, it's legal, I'm allowed. You can't tell me what I can do in my unit. But, my typical example that I give to owners is, look, drums are legal. But it doesn't mean that I can play drums at 12 o'clock at night, or even at any time really in a condo if it's going to disturb other people. And it's the same thing with smoke.
Yeah, and it's really the balance, especially in multi-residential when you're talking about high-rise as opposed to a more sprawling townhouse community, which I'm not saying it doesn't happen because people would be more likely to be on their patio instead of on a balcony. But when you're living with 1,000 other people, you don't get to pick your neighbors all the time, right? So there's part of being a good neighbor and enforcing rules and having some compliance too.
So what do we think about pushback? Do you think that owners that are being enforced against are going to be challenging these rules? Is there anything that we can expect to see there?
I think it's eventually going to happen. There will be some people who will not take so kindly to the rules or even being regulated at all. And the law nerd in me really wants to see what's going to happen. We depend on case law and we have nothing to deal with it right now. So it should be pretty interesting, but I think soon enough it will happen where you'll have a situation where basically we have the allergy versus the need, and then we'll have the allergy versus the recreational. We'll have to deal with that as it comes.
So, it's my view that these rules are absolutely reasonable and they fall under the condominium corporation's rulemaking authority under the Act. And I do believe in the right circumstances it would be upheld if there was a challenge. But, it's really important to understand that if a corporation has implemented a no smoking rule, that it's complaint-based. The enforcement is complaint-based. Because we don't want to see a corporation trying to enforce something when they don't have complaints. Enforcement needs to be reasonable. And if you do have a complaint and it's challenged, I believe if those complaints are legitimate, that it's much less likely that a rule would be overturned when you're dealing with a complaint base. But what a corporation should not be doing is going in for a fire inspection and noticing that somebody's got some cannabis on their counter and saying, we think you're smoking in your unit and we're going to go after you. Because if you try to go after them on bad facts, that's where we get bad law. So it's really important that it's complaint-based.
Or targeting specific people without having any complaints there. Just knowing that someone's smoking doesn't start a file with respect to compliance.
That's right.
Okay. Well, exciting times, changing landscape. Is there anything that condo owners can expect to see today, with the legalization of cannabis as opposed to yesterday when it wasn't legal?
Honestly, probably not really. If you go back, the best example of seeing what legalization looks like is going to Colorado, which legalized it 4 years ago in the States. They're the only ones that really have any studies that can really give you any information. And according to all their statistics, nothing really changed except the revenue of the government in terms of taxes for all the cannabis that they sold. But in terms of usage based on age, gender, sexuality, none of that really changed. So I think really what's been said before today is people might be a little excited over the next week, I think it bears to comment that people who have cannabis today in Ontario probably don't have it legally anyways, like our giant joint over here.
And before today, Canada was one of the highest consumers of cannabis when it wasn't legal, highest literally, to users in the world. So tomorrow it shouldn't be any different.
Go figure out, we're the politest and we're also very relaxed. Go figure. But I will say that my understanding is that in Colorado, in fact, the number of teenagers starting to smoke cannabis has gone down, as opposed to gone up, which I think is an interesting.
But that plays right into the government's intent, right? Restricting access to youth, making sure that now only 19-year-olds can buy it, and if youth are possessing it, it gets into sort of an alcohol type regime, right?
And I also think that once kids see what their parents are doing, it's not cool anymore, and they want to do something else.
So if there's anyone out there watching today that hasn't yet passed a rule in their condo corporation, but they want to do so, are they out of time effectively since it's legal already, or what can be done?
It can be done at any point in time. Okay, so there's no, a lot of people thought it had to be in place by October 17th, and that's not the case. You can implement that rule down the road under the same basis of a prohibition with grandfathering and that kind of thing. But I do want to say that there are different types of rules that can be introduced. So not everyone is outright banning. We have some corporations that have put in provisions to say, look, if you smoke, it's your obligation to make sure that smoke doesn't leave your unit and get into the common elements or other units. And if it does, you're going to be responsible at your sole cost to put a stop to any smoke migration, failing which we can put a stop. We can ban you from smoking in your unit. So that's something that gives corporations some tools that are very specific. And a lot of those corporations will also ban growing and cultivation and processing at the same time, but they're not necessarily taking that step to say you can't do it. As long as you don't bother people, they don't care. So that's another option. The one option is banning, that's no good, is banning cannabis only. It's cannabis and tobacco or some other variation of the rules.
We also have communities that have segregated areas. So whether you're smoking tobacco or cannabis, it's going to be in a special designated area. So instead of in all of the common elements, if you're going to smoke, it's going to be over here versus any of the other areas.
I also think it's important for people to know that when you order online, it comes from Canada Post, and we're now understanding that when it comes to, because a lot of condos are worried about deliveries of cannabis. So our understanding as of today is that it has to be signed for by someone over 19. It cannot be left at a concierge. So if the person's not home, they're going to get a typical note that says, come pick it up, and it has to be signed from somebody over 19. So I don't think corporate condos have to be worried about the concierge taking deliveries of cannabis. Plus, they're going to be sort of these unmarked boxes. So it's not going to identify what's actually in there. So I think that's one thing that people are afraid of that they may not have to be.
And again, that's part of the fear that people not knowing the facts or how it's going to be implemented or what's going to happen. So it's nice that we have some of the states and some other provinces doing different things that we can learn from as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're going for here really is education. People, at the end of the day, whether it's cannabis, whether it's tobacco, they just really need to be mindful of the fact that they live in communities. It's not, your own freehold property where you have no neighbors. Usually most people have neighbors above, below, and to both sides. So you just need to be really conscious of your actions and how it affects others. Like, no one's making really a moral judgment on cannabis. I think it's already been decided in Canada that it's okay.
All right, well, I think that's a good note to end off on. Thanks again to all of you for being here today. Hopefully everyone watching learned a lot from our discussion. And at the end of the day, if you still feel stressed out by all of this, you know what they say, if you can't beat them, join them. So we're going to enjoy some entertainment here. And thanks again to all of you watching.